Let's move our eyes from Wuhan to Hubei for a little while. The U.S. House of Representatives recently passed the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative, or TAIPEI Act of 2019, designed to increase the scope of U.S. interaction with Taiwan. However, in this time of trade war and coronavirus, China is wary that the U.S. is intent on undermining the relations between the Chinese mainland and the island. So what's the purpose of the act and its timing? How does it reflect on current China-U.S. relations? What influence will it have in the cross-Strait relationship? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined via Skype by Teng Jianquan, Director of the Department for American Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and via satellite by Joanna Lei, former Taiwan legislator in Taipei, and Dr. Stanley Kober, independent current affairs commentator in Washington, D.C. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. First of all, Jianquan, what's your take? Okay, Joanna, first of all, let me ask you, what's your take on the impact of this bill on the political foundations of China-U.S. relations?
Well, certainly it enlisted different reactions across Taiwan Straits. But I think even though some people argue that it's more form than substance, it has sent a very strong signal to two constituencies. One is to all those third-party countries, those international communities, to signal very strong U.S. support to Taiwan. And also, it's sending an extremely strong signal to Taiwan's local current Taiwan government of the U.S. support. With these two, it has done something that's unprecedented. It formally linked all the relationship between Taiwan and any third-party countries with the United States' relationship with those third-party countries. For example, it does say if you have expanded, reduced, or terminated, improve, worsen, or sever relationship with Taiwan, then U.S. will have the option to expand, reduce, or terminate U.S. aid. And such a strong signal, even though it's a lot of symbolism, or some people argue it's just form, still it's an unprecedented signal sent by the U.S. Congress.
Yes, Joanna, you did put your point. You did put your finger on a very interesting point, and the media in Chinese mainland seems to keep a low profile on the approval of this act. But let me cross over to Stanley. It seems the reason why majority of the media in Chinese mainland has been pretty quiet on this issue is that it's more symbolic than substantial. Do you agree? Because Joanna, 1 minute earlier, said very much the same, that a lot of symbols instead of a substance. I'd like to have your thoughts.
It is symbolic, but the symbolism, as she stressed, is one of American support. And my concern is, will we be able to make good on the promises? There is an implicit sense of a guarantee here from the United States to Taiwan. And the United States is militarily stretched. And I grew up during the Vietnam War. I didn't serve in Vietnam, but I grew up to it. We made promises to Vietnam. We could not fulfill those promises. We really tried, but we lost the conflict. A lesson I learned from that: don't make promises you can't keep. You're not doing people a favor. And that's my concern here. Yes, it's a strong symbol of support, adds on to other symbols. But when push comes to shove, can we fulfill those promises?
Yes, Stanley, I'm very much impressed by the Hollywood blockbuster Pentagon Papers. It talks about how Washington Post had played a role in suspending the hostilities in Vietnam. Let me go back to Joanna. It seems that Tsai Ing-wen has strengthened her DPP party's ties with the U.S., and now we have a new leader elected in the KMT. to what extent do you think could these bills affect the political pattern on the island, I mean the political ecosystem in Taiwan? How do you view the DPP's attempts to strengthen itself in this way?
Well, certainly Taiwan has taken the opportunity in thanking the United States in the support. She has stretched that Taiwan is a value partner of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. In addition to that, she did stress that Taiwan, in terms of health and also freedom of speech, has a lot to contribute to the international community. I think it is very important to stress that this symbolic bill does have three components. The first one is to help sending signals to the allies, those third-party countries, in terms of U.S. support, as well as showing U.S. support for Taiwan's participation in the international community, whether it requires statehood or not. The second one is to require the United States to look at present, existing, or likely future threats in providing Taiwan defensive arms. So this future potential arms sales clause will have a very strong political echoing in Taiwan's local politics. And the third one is certainly asking the United States to initiate trade negotiations towards a potential FTA. Once again, I would like to stretch that a lot of these will have to be taken by the executive branch, but by so doing, by passing this bill, and if Senate does also pass, the Congress actually has mandated the executive branch to do all these things that's required of them, and also showing its support in more than one way, in arms sales, trade agreements, international participation, in addition to third-party countries' relationship with Taiwan.
Finally, we've been put through via Skype to Teng Jianqun, a senior expert of American studies. Hello, Jianqun. Let's first of all look at the wording of this latest act. It's called the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative. We know that the United States is the only country, a member of the United Nations, that has been able to maintain a kind of very ambiguous, though unofficial relationship with Taiwan. Yet in the title of this act, word like allies is used. Why do you think, because alliance needs to be based on mutual defense treaty, yet Taiwan has none of such with any major countries. So what do you think of the wording and its implications?
This is really a symbolic act adopted by the U.S. Congress. If you look at recent years, you can see a lot of such acts, have been endorsed by the Capitol Hill. But I think some, congressmen from the House, from the Senate, they would like to, manipulate the Taiwan issue for their own sake. This is not only for the sake of the United States or the government of the United States. This is actually only for the sake of the, congressmen themselves. Sometimes they would like to make, a great voice against China, against Taiwan, so they can be popular in the in U.S. politics. This is really a game played by the congressmen. So I think the wording or the the phrase used by the act or by the congressman just gave a strong signal to the outside world that the United States today, especially the congressmen, do not abide by the resolution adopted by the UN in 1971.
Joanna, the U.S. established diplomatic ties with China on the basis of the One China principle more than 40 years ago. What are the grounds for some U.S. congressmen and politicians now trying to punish others for establishing diplomatic ties with Beijing and severing ties with the Taipei? Very quickly, can I have your take?
Well, so that's why I feel that this is sort of unprecedented by linking third-party relationship with Taiwan with the United States actions. But I think it is also important to note that since mainland China has been deemed as a strategic competitor, there are a lot of actions towards using Taiwan as a lever. such as what you mentioned earlier, lots of things are chipping away the foundation of one China policy, which is a cornerstone of the U.S.-China policy for the past 40 years. So in recent years, we see TAIPEI Travel Act. We also see recently Project 2049 has openly advocated that U.S. should start a communique, much like the Shanghai Communique, towards eventually normalize relationship with Taiwan. So I certainly think that Taiwan is now being prioritized in a U.S.-centric policy in the Indo-Pacific. And what they will use Taiwan as the lever for remain to be seen.
At least 10 years ago, there was a lot of media fanfare about whether declaration of independence in Taipei would automatically mean a war or outbreak of hostilities across the Taiwan Strait. And of course, Taiwan and people in Taiwan supposed that they would immediately come under protection by the 7th Fleet of the U.S. Military. But let's go back to the issue of diplomatic breathing space for Taiwan. Stanley, when El Salvador and the Solomon Islands severed ties with Taipei and established ties with Beijing, the U.S. State Department said it was disappointed. The act says that the U.S. government should consider increasing or decreasing the U.S. economic, security, or diplomatic engagement with another nation as a result of an action taken by that nation to either strengthen or undermine ties with Taiwan. It sounds like a tongue twist. But anyway, China regards this as interference in its internal affairs. Stanley, how do you see this?
Well, it is a bit of a double standard since we ourselves recognize China now. We have the American Institute of Taiwan, but we recognize the Chinese government. We shifted the recognition during the Carter administration. So it does look a little strange for the United States to crack down on other countries. But right now, looking strange seems to be a characteristic of U.S. foreign policy, it seems to me. I am more concerned about the effort to reach some sort of creative solution to this one China issue. About 20 years ago at a conference, I asked a question. I'd seen a Chinese white paper on Taiwan, and it said, China will put no security forces on Taiwan after reunification. So I asked one of the Chinese diplomats, how would you collect taxes? And he said, we have no intention of collecting taxes from the people of Taiwan. And it made me wonder, maybe there could be a Commonwealth solution or something like that, and we could reconcile China and Taiwan on that basis. I think we should be focusing on some creative diplomacy in this regard.
So, Stanley, Taiwan is considered a red line issue for the mainland.
Right.
It lays the groundwork for official ties, if there are any official ties in a serious sense, between Washington and Beijing since the outbreak of the trade war. What kind of countermeasures can Beijing employ in your imagination?
If you start escalating this, everybody starts escalating. That's my concern. Even in the United Nations, the memberships, and they're sort of like, you do this, we do this to you. It can get out of control. As you mentioned, the symbolism. And this is my concern. I would like to see some measures to walk things back because I fear a spiral here.
Yeah, so to walk the walk is one thing, but to walk the talk is quite another. Let me go back to Jian Qun.
Yeah.
Jian Qun, let's look at the worst case scenario across the Taiwan Strait. Everybody understands here, particularly on the Chinese mainland, that independence in Taiwan would mean a war. And that's been taken for granted for years, if not since 1949. However, so long as I'm concerned, the mainland has exhausted its efforts, spared no efforts in promoting people-to-people exchanges, economic and trade relationship. Look at ACFA during the years of Ma Ying-jeou. That has delivered a very positive influence. However, all of these seem to have failed when you look at the landslide victory of DPP, the pro-secession political force, now the ruling party in Taiwan. The KMT, despite the change of power, we see new faces of the leadership. What do you think will be the worst-case scenario? What would be the immediate actions should the Taiwan afford to go further down the road of independence?
Yeah, to our knowledge, Madam Tsai seems to have no room to give any compromise in this regard. I mean, to go independent ideologically or in action. I think this is really a dangerous game played by Madam Tsai sometime. I'm sure the last resort for the mainland to maintain the sovereignty and the independence of the country, I think, is the use of force. This is only way for any worst scenario, in the future. But at this moment, I think this is the last resort. This is not the only resort. We still have some, diplomatic leverage or trade leverage to deal with such a challenge with this party. So I think, to my understanding, the mainland or the central government of PRC are actually very confident in dealing with such a challenge. I don't think such a provocation from the U.S. Capitol Hill or the Congress will give any significant change of such a situation, such a status of the the relations across Taiwan Strait. I'm sure the central government will be well prepared to any dangerous game played by Madam Tsai.
But I'm afraid there's more talk on war games in the Pentagon, and it seems the U.S. military is ready to take on China. What do you think of the current state of the male-to-male relationship? Do you think we still have some sort of a dialogue between the two militaries? Now, each year, without exceptions, we're going to have the Shangri-La Security Dialogue, which lays the platform for the two militaries to at least have some symbolic exchange of ideas about issues of common concern in the Indo-Pacific area, if you like. What do you think of the current relationship between the two militaries?
We always say the male-to-male exchanges should be a very important part of the relationship between China and the United States. But in recent years, especially since President Donald Trump came into the White House, he adopted a national strategy called the competition or strategic competition between major powers, between the United States and China. China today as a rival or competitor in the security strategy of the United States. So I think the male-to-male exchanges, to some extent, has been suspended or stopped, including the participation of China Navy in the RIMPAC. Actually, at the very beginning, the United States was very interested in the invitation of China Navy to such exercise, but nowadays they denied such cooperation. Also in some operation other than war. I'm sure China and the United States should continue their cooperation in this regard. To my knowledge, I used to work in the PRA Navy, and I always argue that the first military exercise or drill was called the passage drill. Some U.S. warships and Chinese warships, they carried out such so-called passage drills in the South China Sea. But nowadays, they denied all such cooperations with China. This is really a pity. As two big powers, we should have cooperation in this regard in every aspect, including the military-to-military exchanges.
Since we've been discussing issues concerning the use of the symbols and tokens, let me go back to Joanna and Stanley. What is China called in the vocabulary of the State Department, the Pentagon, or the White House? Is China viewed as enemy, adversary, rival, competitor? Which word comes across more frequently in the vocabulary of these senior government officials? Stanley, first of all.
I am concerned by the language that's being used. Quite frankly, it has gotten extreme, the attitude. It's not just government officials. Throughout this, I see this even among friends of mine. There is an attitude toward China as this diehard enemy of the United States. And this really concerns me. I have a lot of interaction with the students from China, all sorts of students. I was a student in the Soviet Union during the Cold War years. You couldn't really have, the title of your show is Dialogue, you couldn't really become friends because there was a barrier. The students come over here. I think this is a wonderful opening. But for my colleagues, it's everything is seen through the prism of an adversarial relationship at the very least. I find this attitude very disturbing.
Yes, indeed, very much an issue. So, Joanna, in your observation?
Well, I also agree that words are magical and semantic misunderstanding is often and easy. Relatively to 10, 20 years ago, more recently we're seeing China being put in a competitive or even rivalry position. In addition to that, if you look at recent discussions about quote-unquote communist China, it certainly was eliciting a lot of old debates between the U.S. system and the communist regimes. So they also have connotations and denotations. I'd like to just underscore what Stanley said earlier. I think creative solutions and also better understanding, friendship, well-being are the best for Taiwan. And if Taiwan allows itself to go into a potential escalation of war game, whether it's on paper or in reality, it is always, to me, a very dangerous trend. So even linguistic and language use are very important signals. Take Project 2049, for example. I mentioned about their advocacy of a communique with Taiwan for potentially or eventually normalizing relationship with the United States. These kind of languages, coupled with a lot of white papers and policy advocacies by them, has sent our region, cross-strait, into a very dangerous zone. And I think we should be very mindful in terms of what publications they are and what advocacy they're doing at this present time.
Joanna, the U.S. is always lurking behind the Taipei since 1979, exactly 40 years ago, when relationship was normalized between Washington and Beijing. However, we pin our hopes on the younger generation in Taiwan for the improvement of the cross-strait relations under the condition, and I mean very much under the assumption that the KMT has basically lost its ground, despite the recent change of power and leadership in Taipei. What do you make of the prospects of KMT? Do you think the young, newly elected leader of KMT, Mr. Jiang Qichen, will be able to make a big difference?
Jiang Qichen.
Yeah.
Well, certainly Jiang Qichen won by a fairly large margin, but by a small population, because only about 31% of KMT members did vote that day. Jiang Qichen remained relatively silent in terms of his mainland China policy, because for a long period of time, since 2005, Lian Zhan first visited mainland China, China policy has always been a strong suit for KMT in combating DPP's whatever proposition. But Jiang Qichen has remained quite silent. I think he is still trying to figure out whether he will stay in the same 92 consensus course or he will move towards more close to a DPP type of position, because many people have advised him, saying that the mainland China policy or the ability to deal with mainland China is not a strength of KMT, but a potential threat. And even some people argue that this is problematic for KMT. So I think KMT will go through a tailspin for a while to figure out its final position in terms of mainland China policy.
Observers are clearly aware of his inability and failure to mention the principle of 1992 consensus in his inaugural speech, Joanna. What do you think of the change of his wording? Do you think it's a deliberate attempt by Zhang Qichen to avoid the sensitive issue of a cross-strait relationship, which used to be taken very positively by the Pan-Blue camp in Taipei?
Well, Zhang Qichen represents a fraction within KMT that believes that only following or do a Me Too strategy with DPP can allow them to eventually win the leadership again. So I think KMT will be swinging between these two ends, and it will take a while to find out what they really mean. But this time, both candidates, Zhang Qichen and Hao Longbin, has not strongly endorsed 92 consensus. I think it sent a very chilling signal to the Pan-Blue supporters, because either one, right now it's Zhang Qichen at the helm. KMT will not go back to 2005 to 2016, which is the period that KMT did manage to handle the mainland China relationship to the extent that people in Taiwan has given lots of votes supporting KMT's position. And I don't think either one of them have such strong endorsement or commitment to that position.
Jian Quan, there are some observations that I've heard ever since the new leadership was delivered in Taipei, in KMT. These voices said they would rather argue that the KMT is dead in terms of what it used to represent. I mean, the cross-strait relationship and the principle of one China, the 1992 consensus. So these voices argue loudly that KMT is dead. What do you think?
I mean, to some extent, such argument might be right. It is a party with more than 100 years, so it's a long history of such an important party in Taiwan. I think the leaders should think about the future of such a party. If there are divisions among the different groups of interests, I'm sure KMT will continue such a bad, explanation or bad action in the island. So I think, to my understanding, the leaders, no matter young or old, they should think about the unification of the party, to think about the future of the party with such a long history, or they would like to die in the near future.
Thank you very much, everybody. Despite our discussions and debates about the future of Taiwan, especially our focus on the protection of Taiwan, I would say our discussion should hopefully go beyond the protection of Taiwan. We would rather focus on the protection of the public health in Taiwan. And by the way, congratulations on the success, quote unquote, in protecting the health of Taiwan people in combating COVID-19. This is a common concern for people across the Taiwan Strait, and indeed for other parts of the world. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.